Okay, so, it's kind of hard not to feel a little bombarded by everything going on these days, right? Like
Right.
every time you open a news app or you turn on the TV, it's like, bam, another crisis.
It can be a lot.
Yeah, geopolitical tensions, economic uncertainty, the climate, like it's hard to even know where to start,
Yeah.
what to focus on.
Yeah, and that's actually something that's come up in a lot of the sources that you shared,
Uh-huh.
is that it's not even just the events themselves, it's the fact that they're all kind of tied together.
Oh, totally.
And that can make people feel extra anxious because it's not just one thing to deal with. It's like this, like a big web of interconnected stuff.
Yeah, it's like that butterfly effect thing. Ever heard of that?
Oh, yeah.
Like, a butterfly flaps its wings in one place and it causes this whole chain reaction that leads to a hurricane on the other side of the world or something.
Right. It's like that, except with, global conflicts and economies instead of butterflies and
Huh.
hurricanes.
Exactly. And speaking of global conflicts, I mean, the war in Ukraine, it's been on everyone's minds and for good reason.
Yeah, and one of the things that the sources kept highlighting is how this conflict has really shown us just how interconnected everything is.
Oh, for sure.
Take energy prices, for example. The war has had a massive impact on oil and gas prices worldwide, and we're all feeling it at the pump.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah, so it's like something that's happening over there, geographically very far away, has this very direct impact on our daily lives here.
Right. Like, I feel like I need to take out a loan every time I fill up my tank these days.
Exactly, and it's not just gas prices, it's food security too.
True, true.
Ukraine is one of the biggest grain exporters in the world, and the disruption caused by the war has led to like actual food shortages and price hikes in parts of the world that are heavily reliant on those exports.
It's wild to think about how we kind of take it for granted sometimes, that there's always going to be food on the shelves.
Right, until there's not.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, okay, this is a real thing.
Yeah, and it really highlights, like you said, how what happens in one part of the world doesn't just stay there anymore.
Exactly, and it's not even just about the immediate impacts, right? Like
Mhm.
we're also seeing how this war is reshaping global alliances, like with NATO, for example.
Mhm.
It's taken on a much more active role in response to the conflict, and that has these huge implications for the future of international relations, like who's aligning with who and how that might play out in the years to come.
Totally. It's like almost makes you wonder, like, can any conflict truly be isolated anymore in this day and age?
Right. It's a good question.
But, speaking of interconnected crises, I mean, the economic instability that we're seeing right now, that's also partly fueled by these geopolitical tensions too, isn't it?
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
like a domino effect.
Yeah, it's like the pandemic kind of gave the global supply chain a bit of a shake
Yeah,
up.
for sure.
And then just as things were sort of starting to recover from that, the war in Ukraine kind of added this whole other layer of disruption.
Like we needed another thing.
Right. And that's contributing to the rising inflation that we're all dealing with.
Yeah, and you don't need to be an economist to feel that. Like, remember when we used to complain about the price of avocado toast?
Right, right.
Now, it's like going to the grocery store at all is a luxury.
It's a whole thing.
Like, every time I go, it's like I'm bracing myself for the total at the checkout.
Right.
One of the things that I read that really struck me was that the cost of basic necessities, like just basic food, energy, housing, it's skyrocketed this past year.
Oh, yeah, and the housing, especially.
Yeah, it's rough out there.
It's like people are really struggling to afford the essentials, and that takes a toll.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just the financial strain either. It's the mental stress. It's like this constant, like, low-level anxiety because everywhere you turn, there's another headline about rising costs, political instability, climate change. It's a lot to carry.
Yeah, it's a lot to process for sure.
It really is.
And that's kind of where the mental health aspect of all of this really comes in,
Yeah.
because it's like,
It's heavy stuff.
it is heavy stuff. And it's not just you. It's like a lot of people are feeling this sense of overwhelm,
Right.
because it's like we're constantly trying to make sense of this world where the information is changing all the time. Every time you turn around, there's a new headline, a new crisis.
And it's like, how do you even filter through all of that?
Exactly. It's exhausting.
It really is.
And it's not even just about the events themselves. It's like you were saying, that feeling of like, oh my gosh, everything's so unpredictable.
Right, like what's next?
Yeah, exactly.
And that brings us to, well, we can't not talk about climate change. Because that's the other big one that's been looming for a while, but it definitely feels like there's this increasing sense of urgency around it now.
Yeah, and the sources that you shared, they really highlighted that, like, It's not just this abstract future threat anymore.
Right.
We're seeing the impact.
We're living it.
Exactly.
It's like the Earth is saying, okay, enough is enough.
Right. Like, pay attention.
Like we're seeing, those extreme weather events, the heat waves, the droughts, floods, wildfires. They're becoming more and more frequent.
Yeah. It's like, and more intense.
Totally. And one of the articles that I read even, like, they used this analogy of a midlife crisis.
Oh, wow.
Which I thought was kind of funny way to put it, but also kind of accurate.
I mean, it's
a little dramatic.
It's dramatic, but it's like, it's fitting in a way.
It is fitting.
Because it's like, this is serious stuff, We're at this point where it's not just about saving the planet for future generations. It's about, like, our own well-being right now.
Yeah. Right. And the thing about climate change is that it's not just, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right?
Totally.
Like, it intersects with all of these other issues that we're talking about. Like, you think about migration, climate-related migration.
Oh, yeah.
That puts pressure on economies, on resources, and then you get into these questions of social unrest, political instability.
It's like a ripple effect.
Totally.
And it's easy to feel kind of helpless in the face of all of this, Like, what can we actually do?
Right. Like, where do we even begin to tackle all of these huge interconnected problems?
Exactly. But I think the first step is remembering that, like, even though things seem really chaotic and kind of scary right now, there's still hope.
I like that.
And there's a lot that we can do.
Yeah, we're not powerless.
Exactly. We're not powerless.
You just have to, figure out what those actions are.
And how to take them.
Exactly.
And I think a big part of it is, staying informed, but in a way that feels manageable.
Right.
Because it's easy to get sucked into that, constant news cycle and, just be bombarded with negativity.
Oh, absolutely.
But you have to be mindful about the sources that you're choosing and, take breaks when you need to.
Yes, give yourself permission to unplug sometimes.
Exactly. It's like finding that balance.
Totally, because we need to be informed, but we also need to protect our own well-being.
Absolutely.
It's like you can get so caught up in trying to, stay on top of all of this information, reading every article, watching every news segment,
right,
that you forget to actually, take care of yourself in the process.
Yeah, totally. It's like self-care is so important, especially when you're dealing with, heavy topics all the time.
It really is. It's like you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. You got to fill your own cup first.
And I think that's something that's, really easy to forget in this day and age.
It is, because it's like there's this sense of urgency all the time, right?
Yeah.
Like, we got to fix everything right now.
Right.
But you can't really be effective if you're burnt out and exhausted.
Exactly. It's like finding that balance between staying informed and engaged.
Right.
But also, knowing when to step back and take a breather.
Yeah. And I think that's, a big part of building resilience too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being able to acknowledge the challenges.
Yeah.
And, the very real problems that we're facing.
Right.
But not getting so bogged down by them that you lose sight of, the possibility for change and the fact that we can actually make a difference.
Totally. And it's interesting because, we talk a lot about individual action and, what can one person do?
Right.
But I think it's also important to remember that, collective action is where it's at,
Absolutely. It's like that saying, many hands make light work.
Exactly.
One person alone, yeah, it's tough to tackle these huge systemic issues.
Right.
But when people come together,
yes,
and they organize and they collaborate, that's when real change happens.
Think about the climate movement, for example, right? It started with individuals, raising awareness, speaking out, demanding action.
And then it just kind of snowballs.
Right.
And it creates this momentum.
Exactly. So it's yeah, individual actions matter.
They do.
But it's also about recognizing that, we're all in this together.
Absolutely.
And then by working together, we can achieve so much more.
So much more.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, it's a lot to process. It's a lot to think about.
It is.
But I hope that our listeners come away from this feeling not overwhelmed, but empowered.
Yes, exactly.
Because like we've been saying, there is hope. We're not powerless in the face of these challenges. We have agency.
We do.
We have the ability to make choices, to take actions that align with our values.
And to create a better future.
Exactly. And that's a future that's worth fighting for.
Absolutely.
So keep asking questions, keep learning, keep engaging with the world around you.
Yeah, and keep taking care of yourselves.
Yes, so important.
Because we need you. We need everyone to be a part of this.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for, diving deep with me today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, as always, thank you for tuning in. And until next time, keep exploring.